Earth was doomed. The Galactic Kings, rulers of the most powerful empires in the universe, had sent their most vicious creation, a beast so destructive it consumed planets whole. For centuries, the Galactic Kings had viewed humanity as insignificant, a race unworthy of their attention. But now, with Earth standing in the way of their expansion, they unleashed the monster to wipe the planet from existence. Earth's defenses crumbled instantly. The creature appeared in the sky like an unstoppable force, tearing through everything in its path. No weapon could penetrate its thick hide. It fed off energy, consuming nuclear blasts as if they were mere sparks. The military threw everything they had at it: missiles, lasers, even experimental technologies. All were useless. Panic spread across the globe as cities were wiped off the map within hours. Humanity's leaders gathered in their last safe bunker, deep beneath the surface. Desperation filled the room as they reviewed the situation. Every plan had failed. The beast would reach the bunker in a matter of days, if not hours. There were no more options left. Every scientist and military expert had been consulted, and all they could do was watch the inevitable destruction of their world. But one voice, an advisor who had remained silent during most of the discussions, spoke up. His voice was low, almost hesitant, but filled with a strange conviction. He mentioned something that had been buried in Earth's ancient lore. Legends spoke of a being more terrifying than any monster in the galaxy, a creature that had once ruled the night and struck fear into the hearts of men. This being wasn't from Earth's modern time, but from a forgotten era, locked away by those who feared it more than death itself. Dracula, he said, his voice echoing in the cold steel room. The name alone sent a shiver through the room. Most dismissed it immediately as a myth, but they had no other options. If there was even a sliver of truth to the legend, they had to try. With nothing left to lose, the world's leaders agreed to conduct the ritual to summon the ancient vampire lord. It was their only chance. The rituals were buried in texts older than any known civilization, preserved in secret by those who knew of Dracula's power. The process was dangerous, but the leaders had no choice. Deep in the Carpathian Mountains, a group of elite soldiers, scientists, and mystics carried out the ancient rites. Blood was spilled in precise patterns, chants and forgotten languages echoed through the cavern, and the earth itself seemed to tremble as the final words of the incantation were spoken. For a moment, nothing happened. The soldiers stood ready with their weapons, even though they knew they were useless. Then, the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. The shadows in the caves seemed to come alive, twisting and growing, as if something was moving within them. Slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness, tall, pale, and ancient, with eyes that glowed red like the fires of hell. Dracula had returned. The soldiers aimed their weapons, but they were frozen in place, unable to act. The vampire lord's gaze was enough to paralyze them with fear. He took in the scene before him, his expression unreadable. Centuries had passed since he last walked the earth, but the hunger in him was as strong as ever. He could feel the pulse of life around him, the blood coursing through the veins of the humans who had dared to summon him. The lead scientist stepped forward, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. Earth was under attack by an alien force. Their weapons had failed. Their armies were destroyed. Dracula was their last hope. Dracula listened in silence, his expression unmoved by their pleas. When she finished, he spoke, his voice cold and ancient, filled with a power they could barely comprehend. He did not fight for free, he said. If they wanted his help, there would be a price. "Give me dominion over the night," he said, "and I will fight for you. I will require blood to sustain my strength, your blood." The leaders hesitated. Dracula's demand was steep. They would be handing over control of their world's knights to a monster whose thirst for blood was legendary. But what choice did they have? If they refused, the beast would destroy Earth within days. If they accepted, they might live, but under Dracula's rule. It was a terrible choice, but survival left no room for hesitation. They agreed to his terms. Dracula smiled, a dark, predatory smile that sent chills down their spines. He wasted no time. With a flick of his wrist, the shadows around him deepened, and the vampire lord vanished into the night, leaving the humans behind to wonder what they had just unleashed. As the creature continued its path of destruction across the world, Dracula moved faster than the human eye could track. He arrived at the scene of devastation, where the Galactic King's beast stood, towering over the ruins of a once great city. The creature was massive, with scales as hard as steel and eyes that glowed with malevolent hunger. Dracula did not hesitate. He leaped toward the beast with supernatural speed, his fangs bared and his eyes blazing with ancient fury. The battle that followed was unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. The vampire lord fought with a savagery and skill that defied explanation. He summoned creatures of the night to aid him, bats, wolves, and other dark entities that attacked the beast from all sides. For the first time, the Galactic King's beast met resistance. Dracula's power was overwhelming. He struck at the creature's weak points, using his centuries of experience to outmaneuver the giant. But the beast was no ordinary foe. It lashed out with destructive force, leveling mountains and tearing apart the landscape in its attempt to destroy Dracula. Yet Dracula was relentless. He fought with a cold, calculated fury, using every trick he had learned over the millennia. The battle raged on, with both sides inflicting terrible damage upon each other. But eventually, the tide began to turn. Dracula had been summoned, and his presence alone was enough to send waves of unease through the ranks of humanity. Yet, despite their fear, they had no choice but to put their trust in this ancient predator. As the vampire lord stepped out into the shattered world, he took in the ruins of what had once been thriving cities. Destruction was everywhere, and the Galactic King's beast loomed large in the distance, continuing its unstoppable march toward the heart of Earth's remaining population. He moved swiftly, faster than any human could comprehend, his body a blur as he sped across the broken land. In his wake, darkness followed. The sun, already obscured by the smoke and ash of a dying world, seemed to retreat even further as Dracula approached the front lines. Soldiers, barely holding their positions, felt the air grow colder, the shadows deeper. They had never seen a creature like him, and whispers of fear spread like wildfire. But Dracula didn't acknowledge them. Their mortal fears were beneath him. He was focused only on the beast. Its presence filled the air with a stench of decay and raw power. As he reached the battlefield, the creature turned its attention to him. For the first time since it had arrived on Earth, it had encountered something that didn't flee or cower. The massive beast, with its many eyes glowing in the dim light, let out a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath them. Dracula stood his ground. There was no fear in him, no hesitation. He had faced worse monsters in his long, cursed existence. His eyes gleamed red in the gloom as he prepared to engage the enemy. This was not merely a battle of strength, but of strategy and patience, two things Dracula possessed in abundance. He launched himself at the creature with incredible speed, striking at its legs first, attempting to bring it down. His claws, sharp as razors, cut through its thick skin, but the beast retaliated with violent swipes of its massive limbs. It was a clash of titans, one, a creation of ancient science and brutality, the other a timeless creature of supernatural terror. For the first time, the Galactic King's beast found itself in a real fight. Dracula's power was not only in his physical prowess but in his command of the darkness. He called upon the creatures of the night, and from every shadow they answered. Wolves with glowing eyes and bats large enough to block out what little light remained descended upon the battlefield. They tore at the beast's flesh, distracting it while Dracula aimed for the weak points he had quickly identified. The beast, however, was no simple opponent. Its massive tail lashed out, destroying everything in its path. Buildings collapsed under its might, and its roars grew louder with each passing moment. It was designed to destroy worlds, and it had never faced anything like Dracula before. The vampire lord dodged its attacks with ease, using his speed to stay just out of reach. But he knew he couldn't merely outlast this creature. He needed to strike decisively. As the battle raged on, Dracula began to test the limits of the beast's strength. He allowed it to strike him, gauging its power. The blows were devastating, but his body, long accustomed to regenerating from the brink of destruction, healed rapidly. The more he fought, the more he understood the creature's patterns, its weaknesses. Every strike was calculated, every movement precise. Dracula was not just fighting a monster, he was dissecting it, piece by piece. The humans watching from the sidelines couldn't believe what they were seeing. This was not the desperate flailing of their armies, or the panic that had gripped the world when the beasts first arrived. Dracula fought with a cold, calculated fury that terrified even those he was protecting. They had summoned a creature far more powerful and ruthless than they could have ever imagined. The beast might have been an unstoppable force, but Dracula was a force of nature in his own right. Despite the damage he inflicted, the beast continued to fight. It was relentless, driven by a primal hunger to destroy. But Dracula was learning. He was patient, far more patient than any human could have been. He understood that brute force alone would not bring this creature down. It required precision, and more than that, it required Dracula's unique abilities. In the middle of the fight, he paused, stepping back as if observing the beast more closely. The creature, sensing an opportunity, charged at him, but this was what Dracula had been waiting for. He moved with inhuman speed, darting around the beast and leaping onto its back. His claws dug deep into its flesh, and with a hiss that sent chills through the onlookers, he sank his fangs into the creature's hide. This was no ordinary bite. Dracula wasn't just draining the beast's blood, he was draining its very essence. The Galactic Kings had made a fatal mistake in sending this monstrosity to Earth. It wasn't just any creature, it was alive, and anything alive could fall victim to Dracula's insatiable hunger. As he drank, the beast roared in agony, its strength fading rapidly. Dracula's powers grew as he fed, his body pulsing with new energy. The more he consumed, the weaker the beast became, until finally, with one last bellow of fury, it collapsed. Dracula stood atop its massive corpse, his eyes glowing bright red, his body radiating with newfound strength. The darkness around him seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, as if the night itself was bowing to his will. The soldiers stared in stunned silence. The beast was dead. Dracula had done what no human weapon could. But as the reality of their victory set in, so did the fear. Dracula turned to face them, his expression unreadable, his mouth still stained with the blood of the creature. He had fulfilled his part of the bargain, but his gaze made it clear, he expected them to fulfill theirs. They had called upon Dracula, and now they were bound to him. The battle had been won, but the price had yet to be paid. Dracula stood victorious, the beast's corpse sprawled beneath him. Its massive frame, once a symbol of unstoppable destruction, now lay still, defeated by the ancient vampire's relentless power. The soldiers who had been watching from a distance felt an odd mix of awe and dread. Humanity had been saved, but at what cost? The battlefield was littered with ruins and bodies, and Dracula, with his crimson-stained mouth and glowing eyes, seemed more dangerous than ever. There was a palpable shift in the air. The human leaders, who had been so desperate for any hope of survival, now found themselves confronting the dark reality of their decision. They had summoned a monster to fight another, but now, Dracula was growing stronger by the minute. The power he had drained from the beast had invigorated him beyond anything they could have anticipated. The shadows around him moved unnaturally, as though responding to his will, and his presence alone seemed to drain the life from the air itself. Dracula had no need for words. His gaze alone was enough to remind the humans of the deal they had struck. He had kept his end of the bargain, and now it was time for them to keep theirs. Dominion over the night, and the blood he had been promised. This was his price for saving their world. But the leaders, their fear growing with every passing moment, began to realize just how dangerous their new savior truly was. Whispers spread among the ranks of soldiers and officials. Could they really allow Dracula to claim what he demanded? The beast was gone, yes, but was it worth surrendering Earth's knights to a creature whose hunger for power seemed boundless? Some argued that Dracula had proven his loyalty by fighting for them, that perhaps he could be reasoned with. But others, more fearful, questioned if they had simply traded one threat for another, this time, a threat they couldn't control. Dracula, sensing their hesitation, made his move. He didn't wait for them to decide. With a simple gesture, the shadows around him deepened, and in an instant, he vanished into the night. But he wasn't gone. No, he had spread his influence across the world. Cities, already battered from the beast's rampage, were soon under a new kind of siege. Dracula's night creatures, wolves with glowing eyes, enormous bats, and other creatures from nightmares, began to appear across the globe. His control over the night had begun. Reports started flooding in from every corner of the world. In the cities that had survived the beast, people were now too afraid to go outside after sunset. Wolves prowled the streets, their howls echoing through the empty alleys, while bats circled overhead, blotting out the moon. Entire towns were plunged into fear as Dracula's influence grew stronger each night. He wasn't attacking humanity directly, but his message was clear: the night now belonged to him. In the bunkers where the human leaders hid, the tension grew unbearable. They had wanted to survive the Galactic King's assault, but now they had to ask themselves what kind of world they had survived for. Could they live under the rule of an ancient predator, whose thirst for blood and power was unquenchable? The debates grew more heated with every passing hour. Some still believed they could negotiate with Dracula, that perhaps he could be reasoned with now that the immediate threat had passed. But others, those who had seen the true extent of his power, knew better. There was no reasoning with Dracula. He had been alive for centuries, and he had no interest in diplomacy or compromise. He had agreed to save them, and he had done so, but now the earth was his playground. The leaders realized too late that they had never been his equals in this bargain. They had been pawns, pieces in a game Dracula had been playing for longer than they could imagine. The tipping point came when Dracula himself appeared at one of the remaining strongholds. It was a cold night, the kind where the air seemed to freeze in your lungs. Dracula, as if emerging from the darkness itself, appeared without warning. He walked through the camp like a king surveying his kingdom, his expression one of cold indifference. The soldiers, despite their weapons, didn't dare stop him. They knew nothing they carried could harm him. Dracula approached the human leaders, who had gathered in a desperate attempt to confront him. Their voices, once filled with authority, were now shaky, barely concealing the fear that had taken root. They demanded that he stop his creatures, that he release the night back to humanity. But Dracula, with a voice like ice, simply reminded them of the deal they had made. His part of the bargain was done, now they were his. He didn't need to raise his voice. The cold, matter-of-fact tone in which he spoke made it clear that their protests were meaningless. The leaders, realizing they had no power over him, fell silent. Some tried to negotiate, offering resources, land, anything they thought might appease him. But Dracula wasn't interested in their offers. He had claimed the night, and no amount of bargaining would change that. As he turned to leave, one of the leaders, perhaps braver or more foolish than the others, dared to ask what his ultimate goal was. Dracula paused, his back still turned to them, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice that sent shivers down their spines, he answered, "I have no need for your world, nor your people. I care not for your politics, your wars, your lives. But the night belongs to me." With that, he vanished into the darkness once more, leaving the humans to grapple with the full weight of their decision. The world had been saved from the Galactic Kings, but at what cost? Now every sunset brought with it a new kind of terror. Dracula ruled the night, and humanity's place in this new world was uncertain. The leaders knew they had a choice to make. Either they lived under Dracula's reign, or they fought back, risking everything to reclaim the freedom they had once taken for granted. But even as they whispered of rebellion, they knew the truth deep down. Dracula was not a foe they could defeat with weapons or tactics. He was something far older, far more dangerous than any threat they had ever faced. The world had changed. Days still belonged to humanity, but the nights were ruled by fear. Every sunset brought the same suffocating tension, knowing that the darkness was no longer safe. Dracula's dominion over the night was absolute, and it seemed as though Earth had traded one doom for another. The Galactic King's beast had been defeated, but the question now loomed, Could humanity live under the rule of an ancient vampire lord who had no interest in their survival, only his power? In the weeks that followed Dracula's victory, whispers of rebellion spread among the human leaders. They had survived extinction, but the cost had been too great. Cities lived in perpetual fear, with curfews enforced by the invisible hand of Dracula's night creatures. Humans stayed indoors after dusk, fearful of what lurked in the shadows. No one dared challenge Dracula openly, but underground movements began to form. They knew it was only a matter of time before Dracula's hunger would grow beyond his agreement. A council was called, one final desperate attempt to free Earth from the grip of its new ruler. The remaining military commanders, scientists, and political leaders gathered in secret, far from the eyes of Dracula's ever-watching night. They debated, argued, and plotted. Could Dracula be destroyed? Did they have any weapon that could stand against him? Most of the experts were quick to remind everyone that their conventional weapons had already failed. Dracula's supernatural abilities rendered him impervious to the strategies that had saved them in past conflicts. But there was one among them who thought differently. A scientist who had been studying the vampire lord since his summoning believed they had a way to strike back. Dracula, while immensely powerful, was not invulnerable. There were ancient methods, forgotten techniques that had been used centuries ago to subdue creatures like him. If they could gather the necessary materials, they might have a chance to imprison Dracula once more, just as he had been locked away for centuries before. The plan was dangerous and fraught with uncertainty. Even if they managed to subdue him, there was no telling what retaliation they might face from his night creatures. The risk was great, but it was clear to everyone in the room that their options were limited. Either they acted now or accepted a future where humanity would be nothing more than cattle to feed Dracula's endless thirst. Preparations began immediately. Under the cover of day, the humans worked tirelessly to create the trap that might seal Dracula away. The knowledge they needed came from ancient texts, and finding the materials was no small feat. Everything had to be done in secret, for even the slightest hint that they were planning against him could bring Dracula's wrath upon them. The rebellion's leaders moved quickly and quietly, knowing that time was not on their side. As the final pieces of the trap came together, Dracula, in his infinite patience, remained unaware, or so it seemed. His creatures continued to patrol the night, keeping the humans in check but never interfering directly. The rebellion leaders took this as a sign that their plan might work. If Dracula suspected nothing, then they stood a chance. The trap was set. They would lure Dracula into a contained area, a bunker designed to withstand nuclear blasts, reinforced with layers of old magic and technology that would weaken his power. It was a gamble, but the rebellion believed that if they could get Dracula into this space, they might be able to imprison him once more. The bait was simple, a promise of a massive offering of blood, one that Dracula wouldn't be able to resist. It was risky, but the hunger that drove him was something they could count on. Dracula arrived without fanfare. He didn't need to announce his presence. The air itself seemed to grow colder as he approached the designated location. The humans who had laid the trap watched from hidden vantage points, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. As Dracula entered the bunker, there was a moment of stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, the trap was sprung. The doors slammed shut, sealing Dracula inside. The magic and technology activated, and for a brief moment, there was hope. The humans watched as Dracula stood in the center of the bunker, his expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, they thought they had succeeded. But then, with a simple gesture, Dracula dispelled the ancient magic as if it were nothing more than a minor annoyance. The rebellion's plan had failed. Dracula's eyes burned with fury, his once icy demeanor replaced by something far more terrifying. He hadn't been unaware of their plans, he had simply allowed it to play out, amused by their desperation. Now, they had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. With a wave of his hand, the shadows inside the bunker came alive, twisting and coiling like serpents, reaching for the humans who had dared to challenge him. Panic erupted. The leaders of the rebellion scrambled to escape, but Dracula's creatures were faster. One by one, they were pulled into the darkness, their screams echoing through the bunker. It was over in minutes. The trap had not only failed, it had sealed the fate of those who had dared to oppose Dracula. As the last of the rebellion leaders were consumed by the shadows, Dracula stood alone in the bunker. The humans had underestimated him, as all mortals did. He had allowed them to think they stood a chance, to entertain the illusion of hope, but in the end, they were nothing more than prey to him. He had no interest in ruling them directly, but he would not tolerate defiance. The night was his domain, and those who lived under it would learn to respect his rule. The aftermath of the failed rebellion was swift and brutal. News spread quickly across the remaining cities. Those who had spoken of resisting Dracula fell silent. The world had changed once again. Dracula had asserted his dominance, and now, humanity faced a new reality, one where they could never truly be free, where the night belonged to a power far beyond their understanding. Dracula did not return to their councils, nor did he demand further tribute. He simply let them live in fear, knowing that at any moment, he could take what he wanted. The Galactic Kings had been a distant threat, but Dracula was ever present, a reminder that humanity's darkest enemy had always been closer than they realized. The nights were long, and the future uncertain, but one thing was clear: Dracula's reign had only just begun.